The summer heat pressed down on the small frontier town like a heavy blanket. Sarah Whitehorse stood at the edge of the general store, her dark eyes watching the dusty main street. She was 22 years old, with long black hair that fell past her shoulders and copper-toned skin that marked her Apache heritage. Most folks in town kept their distance from her, not because she caused trouble, but because everyone knew about her 5 brothers who lived up in the canyon country. Thomas Mackenzie rode into town that afternoon on a chestnut mare, his cowboy hat pulled low against the sun. He was new to the territory, having bought a small ranch about 15 miles outside of town. He had sandy hair, blue eyes, and a quiet way about him that made people curious. When he tied his horse outside the store and stepped onto the wooden walkway, his eyes met Sarah's for just a moment. Something passed between them in that brief glance. Sarah felt her heart skip, though she quickly looked away. Thomas tipped his hat to her before disappearing into the store. She told herself it meant nothing, that she should forget about the cowboy with the kind eyes. Her brothers would never approve of her talking to a white man, especially not a newcomer who didn't understand their ways. But fate had different plans. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Thomas kept running into each other. First at the store, then at the creek where Sarah sometimes went to gather herbs for her grandmother. Thomas would be there watering his horse, and they would exchange a few words. His voice was gentle, and he never looked at her the way other white men did, with either fear or contempt. He looked at her like she was just a person, someone worth knowing. Their conversations grew longer. Thomas told her about his dreams for his ranch, how he wanted to raise cattle and build a good life. Sarah shared stories about the land, teaching him which plants were safe and which ones to avoid. She showed him the best fishing spots and warned him about where flash floods could happen during storms. They never planned these meetings, but somehow they kept happening. Sarah's youngest brother, Daniel, was the first to notice. He was only 16 but had sharp eyes and a protective nature. He followed Sarah one afternoon and saw her sitting by the creek with Thomas, both of them laughing at something. Daniel's face darkened with anger. He didn't confront them that day, but he went straight to their eldest brother, Joseph. Joseph Whitehorse was a man of few words, but great presence. At 30 years old, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders and arms thick from years of hard work. He had taken care of his siblings since their parents died 10 years ago, and he took that responsibility seriously. When Daniel told him about Sarah and the cowboy, Joseph's jaw tightened. That evening, all 5 brothers gathered in their home in the canyon. Besides Joseph and Daniel, there was Marcus, who was 28, twins Robert and William, who were 25, and all of them shared the same protective fury when it came to their only sister. They had watched her grow up, had shielded her from the prejudices of the white settlers, and had always assumed she would marry someone from their own people or from one of the neighboring Apache families. The next day, Joseph rode down to confront Sarah. He found her gathering firewood near their grandmother's cabin. His voice was stern as he asked her about the cowboy. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the branches, but she lifted her chin defiantly. She admitted that she had been talking to Thomas but insisted they were just friends. She could see the disappointment in Joseph's eyes, which hurt worse than any anger. Joseph forbade her from seeing Thomas again. He said the cowboy would only bring trouble, that white men couldn't be trusted, and that she was putting herself and the family at risk. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that Thomas was different, but she knew her brother's word was law in their family. She nodded silently, tears burning in her eyes. But love, once planted, is hard to uproot. Sarah tried to stay away from town, tried to forget about Thomas Mackenzie and his gentle smile. She threw herself into her work, helping her grandmother with the cooking and the garden, mending clothes, and doing everything she could to keep busy. Yet every night she lay awake thinking about him, wondering if he was thinking about her too. Thomas noticed Sarah's absence immediately. He rode into town week after week, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but she never appeared. He asked around carefully, not wanting to cause her trouble, but the locals just shrugged or gave him suspicious looks. Finally, one older woman who ran the boarding house took pity on him. She told him quietly that Sarah's brothers had found out about their friendship and had ordered her to stay away. Instead of being discouraged, Thomas felt his determination grow stronger. He had never felt about anyone the way he felt about Sarah. She made him laugh, made him think, made him want to be a better man. He decided he would prove himself worthy, not just to Sarah but to her brothers too. He would show them he was honorable, that his intentions were pure, and that he respected their culture and their family. But Thomas didn't understand the depth of the brothers' opposition. He didn't know about the years of broken treaties, the lies told by white settlers, the land stolen from Apache families. He didn't know about their father, who had trusted a white rancher and ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. He didn't know that to the Whitehorse brothers, every white man was a potential threat. Sarah's resolve began to weaken after a month of staying away. She missed Thomas terribly, missed their conversations and the way he made her feel seen and valued. One evening, she slipped away from her grandmother's cabin and rode toward town, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She told herself she would just see him one more time, just to explain why she couldn't see him anymore. She found Thomas sitting on his porch, staring out at the sunset. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with joy and relief. They talked for hours that night, sharing their feelings for the first time. Thomas held her hand and promised he would find a way for them to be together. Sarah wanted to believe him, but she knew her brothers would never accept it. What neither of them realized was that Daniel had followed Sarah again, and this time he had brought Marcus with him. The moon was high when Sarah finally rode back toward the canyon, her heart still warm from the evening with Thomas. She didn't see her brothers waiting in the shadows until it was too late. Marcus stepped out onto the trail, blocking her path, while Daniel emerged from the other side. Her horse startled, and Sarah had to grip the reins tightly to keep from being thrown. Marcus's face was like stone in the moonlight. He didn't yell or shout. Instead, his voice was low and cold as he told Sarah to get down from her horse. She obeyed, her legs shaking. Daniel took her horse's reins while Marcus walked her back to their family home. The whole way, neither brother spoke, and that silence was more terrifying than any words could have been. Joseph was waiting at the house with Robert and William. The disappointment on Joseph's face cut Sarah deeper than any blade. He had trusted her to obey him, to respect the family's wishes, and she had betrayed that trust. For the first time in her life, Sarah saw her eldest brother truly angry. His voice shook as he asked her how she could be so foolish, how she could risk everything for a white cowboy she barely knew. Sarah tried to explain. She told them Thomas was different, that he was kind and respectful. She said she was old enough to make her own choices about who she spent time with. But her words only made things worse. Joseph stepped forward and slapped her across the face, the sound echoing in the quiet night. Sarah staggered back, her hand flying to her burning cheek. She had never been struck by her brother before. The other brothers looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge Joseph's authority. Joseph told Sarah she was confined to their grandmother's cabin. She was not to leave without permission, not to go to town, not to see the cowboy again. If she disobeyed one more time, he said, there would be worse consequences than a slap. Sarah nodded through her tears and was led away by their grandmother, who had been watching from the doorway with sad, knowing eyes. The old woman cleaned Sarah's face and made her tea that night. She didn't lecture or scold. Instead, she told Sarah a story about her own youth, about a man she had loved who was from a different tribe. Her family had forbidden it, and she had obeyed them. She married the man they chose for her, Sarah's grandfather, and had a good life. But sometimes late at night she still thought about the man she had loved first. She told Sarah that love was powerful, but so was family, and sometimes the heart had to make impossible choices. Days turned into weeks. Sarah remained at her grandmother's cabin, doing chores and trying to accept her fate. Her brothers took turns watching her, making sure she didn't slip away again. The bruise on her face faded, but the ache in her heart remained. She wondered what Thomas thought, whether he believed she had simply changed her mind about him. The thought of him thinking she didn't care was almost worse than the loneliness. Thomas, meanwhile, had realized something was seriously wrong when Sarah didn't return. He waited for 3 days, then rode out to find the Whitehorse property. He didn't know exactly where they lived, but he asked around carefully. Most people warned him to stay away, told him the Whitehorse brothers were dangerous and protective. One old rancher told him that going out there could get him killed, but Thomas was determined. He finally found someone willing to give him directions, a Mexican farmhand who had worked with Marcus before. The man warned Thomas that he was making a mistake, but Thomas's mind was made up. He rode out on a cloudy afternoon, following the trail up into the canyon country. The landscape was beautiful but harsh, with red rocks jutting up toward the sky and vegetation clinging to life in the dry soil. He found the White Horse home as the sun was setting. It was a sturdy adobe structure with a corral nearby where several horses grazed. Thomas could see smoke rising from the chimney. He dismounted and walked toward the house, his heart pounding. Before he reached the door, it swung open and Joseph stepped out, followed by Marcus and the twins. Thomas removed his hat respectfully and introduced himself. He said he had come to speak about Sarah, to explain his intentions. Joseph's eyes were hard as flint. He told Thomas that Sarah was not his concern, that he should ride back to his ranch and forget he ever met her. Thomas stood his ground, saying he couldn't do that he cared about Sarah and wanted to do things properly. He asked permission to court her. The brothers exchanged glances. Then Joseph laughed, but there was no humor in it. He asked Thomas what made him think a white cowboy would ever be good enough for their sister. He brought up the history between their peoples, the broken promises, the stolen land. He told Thomas that men like him had brought nothing but pain to families like theirs. Thomas listened, understanding for the first time the depth of their mistrust. Thomas tried to respond, tried to say he was not like those other men, that he respected their culture and their family. But Joseph wasn't interested in hearing it. He told Thomas to leave and never come back. If he saw him near Sarah again, there would be consequences. The twins stepped forward menacingly, and Thomas knew he was outnumbered. Reluctantly, he put his hat back on and returned to his horse. As he was mounting up, he heard a sound and looked toward a small cabin set back from the main house. In the window, he saw Sarah's face, pale and sad. Their eyes met for just a moment before an old woman pulled her back from the window. Thomas's chest tightened with anger and sadness. He wanted to rush to her, to take her away from there, but he knew that would only make things worse. He rode slowly back down the canyon trail, his mind racing. He couldn't just give up on Sarah, but he didn't know how to change her brothers' minds. They had every reason to distrust him based on history, and he couldn't blame them for that. But he also couldn't stop loving Sarah. There had to be a way forward, some way to prove himself. Back at the White Horse home, Sarah was being lectured again by Joseph. He had seen the look that passed between her and Thomas, and it confirmed his fears that her feelings hadn't changed. He told her she was being foolish, that the cowboy would tire of her eventually, or that his family back east would never accept an Apache wife. He said she was risking her reputation and her safety for a fantasy. Sarah finally found her voice. She told Joseph that she appreciated everything he had done for the family, but she was not a child anymore. She said she understood the risks, but she also believed that Thomas was genuine. She argued that holding on to old hatred would only breed more hatred, and that not all white men were the same. Her words were bold, perhaps too bold. Joseph's hand rose again, and this time Marcus caught it. The second brother spoke quietly, saying that hitting Sarah wouldn't change her heart. He suggested they needed a different approach. Joseph lowered his hand, breathing heavily. He looked at his sister with a mixture of anger and something else, maybe fear of losing her. He told her she would remain confined until she came to her senses, however long that took. 3 months passed like a slow torture for Sarah. She remained confined to her grandmother's cabin, watched constantly by one brother or another. The old woman tried to keep her spirits up, teaching her traditional songs and stories, but Sarah felt like a bird in a cage. Every day she thought about Thomas, wondered if he had given up on her, if he had moved on with his life. The thought filled her with a deep sadness that no amount of work or prayer could ease. Thomas had not given up. He spent those months working harder than ever on his ranch, but he also made other efforts. He began trading with some of the Apache families who lived on the outskirts of town, always treating them fairly and with respect. He learned a few words of their language. He helped an elderly Apache man fix his wagon wheel without asking for payment. Slowly, word began to spread that the new cowboy was different from most white settlers. One day, a letter arrived at the White Horse home. It was brought by a Mexican trader who did business with both the Apache families and the white settlers. Joseph opened it suspiciously, expecting some kind of threat or trick. Instead, he found a carefully written letter from Thomas addressed to him and his brothers. The cowboy wrote about his feelings for Sarah, but also about his respect for their family and their concerns. Thomas explained his background in the letter. He came from a poor family in Texas, had worked hard for everything he had and understood what it meant to be looked down upon by others. He acknowledged the wrongs done to the Apache people and said he wanted no part in continuing that injustice. He offered to meet with the brothers on neutral ground to answer any questions they had and to prove his sincerity. He ended by saying he would wait as long as necessary for a chance to show he was worthy of their consideration. The brothers gathered to discuss the letter. Daniel wanted to tear it up and send the pieces back as their answer. Robert and William were indifferent, thinking the cowboy would eventually get tired and leave on his own. But Marcus surprised everyone by suggesting they hear him out. He pointed out that Sarah's confinement was making her miserable, and she was growing more stubborn rather than less. Maybe, he said, they should test this cowboy, see if he was truly as honorable as he claimed. Joseph was torn. Part of him wanted to reject Thomas outright, to protect his sister from potential heartbreak or worse. But another part of him, the part that loved Sarah and wanted her happiness, wondered if Marcus might be right. After much debate, they decided to send a response. They would meet with Thomas, but on their terms. He would have to come alone to their canyon, and he would have to prove himself through actions, not just words. When Thomas received the reply, his heart soared with hope. He prepared carefully for the meeting, bringing gifts that showed respect but weren't too extravagant. He chose a beautiful blanket woven by a local craftsman, tobacco for a peace pipe, and a promise to listen more than he spoke. The appointed day was a cool autumn morning, and Thomas rode into the canyon with both anticipation and fear. The brothers were waiting for him at a clearing near their home. All 5 of them stood in a line, and Thomas felt the full weight of their presence. Joseph stepped forward and invited Thomas to sit at their fire. The cowboy accepted, sitting cross-legged on the ground across from them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Joseph began to ask questions. He asked about Thomas's family, his past, his plans for the future. He asked why Thomas wanted to be with Sarah, what he could offer her, how he would protect her. Thomas answered each question honestly and carefully. He admitted he wasn't rich, but he was hardworking. He said he loved Sarah's intelligence and strength, her kindness and courage. He promised he would spend his life making sure she never regretted choosing him. Then Marcus asked the harder questions. He asked how Thomas would handle the prejudice they would face from both white society and some Apache families. He asked if Thomas was prepared to be rejected by his own people for marrying an Apache woman. He asked if Thomas understood that any children they had would face challenges from both worlds. Thomas's answers showed he had thought deeply about these issues. He acknowledged the difficulties but said he believed love and respect could overcome them. The twins tested him differently. They challenged him to demonstrate his skills, to show he could survive and provide for a family in this harsh land. Thomas accepted every challenge. He showed his skill with a rope, his knowledge of animal tracking, and his ability to read the land for water and shelter. He wasn't perfect, but he was competent and willing to learn. The twins nodded with grudging respect. Young Daniel was the hardest to convince. He asked Thomas bluntly why they should trust him when so many white men had lied to their people before. Thomas had no easy answer for this. He simply said that he couldn't change the past or speak for other men. All he could do was show through his actions who he truly was. He offered to work for them without pay, to prove his commitment and earn their trust over time. Joseph considered everything carefully. He could see that Thomas was sincere, but sincerity alone wasn't enough. He needed to know that this cowboy had the strength to stand up for Sarah when things got difficult. So he proposed a test. Thomas would work on their ranch for 3 months. During this time, he would live as one of them, work alongside them and learn their ways. He would not see Sarah or speak to her. If at the end of 3 months he still wanted to be with her, and if he had proven himself trustworthy, they would allow him to court her properly. Thomas agreed without hesitation. He knew it would be hard, especially being so close to Sarah without being able to see her, but he also knew this was his chance to prove himself and he wouldn't waste it. Joseph nodded with approval at Thomas's quick acceptance. He stood and offered his hand. Thomas stood as well and shook it, feeling the incredible strength in the older man's grip. The brothers led Thomas to a small cabin where ranch hands usually stayed. They gave him a bedroll and basic supplies. Starting the next morning, they told him he would work from sunrise to sunset. He would care for the horses, mend fences, help with the harvest, and do whatever else was needed. He would eat with the family but would not speak to Sarah. If he broke this rule, the deal was off and he would be sent away permanently. That first night, Thomas lay in the dark cabin, listening to the sounds of the canyon. Somewhere in another cabin nearby, Sarah was probably lying awake too. He wondered if she knew he was there, if anyone had told her about the arrangement. The thought of being so close yet unable to see her was painful, but he reminded himself why he was doing this. 3 months was nothing compared to a lifetime with Sarah. Sarah did know. Her grandmother had told her about the meeting and the arrangement, thinking it would give her hope. But Sarah felt conflicted. She was touched by Thomas's willingness to prove himself, but she also worried about what her brothers might do to test him. She knew they could be hard men when they wanted to be, and she feared they might push Thomas too far, hoping he would give up. The next morning, Thomas woke before dawn and reported to Joseph. The work began immediately, and it was harder than anything Thomas had done before. The brothers didn't go easy on him because he was trying to win their sister. If anything, they worked him harder than they worked themselves. By the end of the first day, Thomas's muscles screamed in pain and his hands were blistered. But he didn't complain. He simply thanked them for the day's lessons and returned to his cabin. This pattern continued day after day. Thomas learned to shoe horses the Apache way, to track animals through terrain he had never encountered, to predict weather by signs he had never noticed before. 6 weeks into Thomas's trial period, something unexpected happened. A group of white ranchers from a neighboring county rode onto Whitehorse land, claiming that several Apache families had stolen their cattle. They were angry, armed, and looking for trouble. Joseph and his brothers went out to meet them, and Thomas, working in the corral, heard the commotion and followed. The leader of the ranchers was a man named Clayton Burke, known for his hatred of Apache people. When he saw Thomas standing with the Whitehorse brothers, his face twisted with disgust. He asked Thomas what he was doing with these people, whether he had lost his mind. Thomas stood his ground and said he was working for the Whitehorse family, and that he knew them to be honest people who wouldn't steal cattle. Burke laughed mockingly and called Thomas a traitor to his own kind. He said the cattle had definitely been taken by Apache thieves, and he intended to get them back one way or another. Joseph stepped forward and said calmly that no one from his family or the nearby Apache community had taken any cattle. He suggested the cattle might have wandered off or been taken by actual rustlers who operated in the area regardless of race. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Burke's men had their hands on their guns, and the Whitehorse brothers were equally ready for trouble. Thomas found himself in an impossible position. These were men from his own community, people he might have called neighbors under different circumstances. But they were wrong, and they were threatening people he had come to respect, including the family of the woman he loved. Thomas stepped forward and addressed Burke directly. He said he had lived in the territory long enough to know that the Apache families in this area were peaceful, hardworking people. He pointed out that Clayton Burke had a reputation for looking for excuses to cause trouble with his Apache neighbors. He suggested that Burke was more interested in taking Apache land than in finding his cattle. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Burke's face turned red with rage.
He told Thomas he would regret taking sides against his own people.
He and his men turned their horses around and rode off, but not before Burke shouted back that this wasn't over. Thomas felt the weight of what he had just done. He had publicly taken a stand against men from the white community, had called one of them out for prejudice and land grabbing. There would be consequences. Joseph looked at Thomas with new eyes. The cowboy had just risked his reputation and possibly his safety to stand up for their family. It was the kind of loyalty that couldn't be faked. Marcus clapped Thomas on the shoulder, a gesture of respect. Even Daniel seemed to view Thomas differently after that day. The cowboy had proven that his commitment to Sarah extended beyond romantic feelings. He was willing to be part of their world, with all the challenges that entailed. But Sarah's brothers were also worried. They knew Burke wasn't the type to forget an insult or let things go. Sure enough, word soon spread through the white community that Thomas Mackenzie had turned traitor, that he was an Indian lover who had chosen savages over his own kind. Some of his former friends stopped doing business with him. The general store owner was cold when Thomas came to town. The divide between Thomas and the white community was growing wider. Sarah heard about the confrontation from her grandmother, who had heard it from Marcus. Her heart swelled with pride and love for Thomas, but also with fear. She knew what it meant for a white man to be ostracized by his own people. She worried that Thomas might come to resent her for it, that the price might prove too high. She wanted to see him, to talk to him, but she knew the rules. She had to wait. Thomas continued working hard, but now the Whitehorse brothers included him in more family discussions. They began teaching him about Apache traditions, explaining the meaning behind certain customs and ceremonies. He learned about their history, both the triumphs and the tragedies. He understood more deeply why they were so protective of Sarah, why they had such difficulty trusting outsiders. One evening, Joseph invited Thomas to sit with them by the fire. The older brother spoke about their parents, how they had died, and the responsibility he felt for his siblings. He admitted that his greatest fear was failing them, especially Sarah. He said he could see that Thomas was a good man, but he needed to know if Thomas was strong enough to withstand the pressure that would come from both communities if he married Sarah. Thomas answered with quiet conviction. He said he wouldn't lie and claim it would be easy. He knew there would be difficult times ahead, but he had already made his choice, and the opposition from Burke and others had only strengthened his resolve. He said that Sarah was worth fighting for, worth standing up for, worth any sacrifice he might have to make. He looked Joseph in the eye and said he would spend his life proving that he was worthy of her trust and love. Joseph was silent for a long time. Then he told Thomas about a test that still remained. In 2 weeks, there would be a gathering of several Apache families for a traditional ceremony. Thomas would be invited to attend. How he conducted himself there, how he was received by the community, would be the final factor in their decision. If the elders and the community accepted him, then Joseph and his brothers would give their blessing for him to court Sarah. The 2 weeks passed slowly. Thomas prepared himself mentally and emotionally for the gathering. He practiced the few Apache words he had learned, reviewed the customs that had been taught to him, and prayed that he would not embarrass himself or the Whitehorse family. He also thought about Sarah constantly. It had been almost 3 months since he had seen her, and the longing was almost physical. Sarah, meanwhile, was preparing for the gathering as well. She would be there, and she knew Thomas would be too. It would be the first time they had seen each other in so long. She wondered if his feelings had changed, if the hardship had made him reconsider. She tried to prepare herself for the possibility that he might have decided she wasn't worth the trouble after all. The day of the gathering arrived. Families came from miles around, bringing food and stories and laughter. There was music and dancing, traditional foods cooking over fires, and children running and playing. Thomas arrived with the Whitehorse brothers, feeling nervous and out of place. Many eyes turned to him, some curious, some suspicious, some openly hostile. He kept his head up and his manner respectful. Joseph introduced Thomas to the tribal elders, explaining the situation and asking for their wisdom and blessing. The elders listened carefully, asked Thomas questions, and observed how he carried himself. One old man who had known the Whitehorse parents was particularly interested in Thomas's motivations and character. He asked pointed questions about how Thomas planned to honor both his own background and Sarah's Apache heritage. Then Sarah entered the gathering. Thomas saw her from across the clearing, and time seemed to stop. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, wearing traditional Apache dress and with her hair braided. Their eyes met, and in that moment Thomas knew that nothing had changed for him. If anything, his love for her had grown stronger through the separation and the challenges. Sarah felt her breath catch when she saw Thomas. He looked different, more weathered perhaps, but there was a strength in his bearing that hadn't been there before. He had changed during his time with her brothers, had become more confident in this world that was so different from his own. She wanted to run to him, but she held back, knowing that the eyes of the entire community were watching. The elders deliberated while the gathering continued around them. They spoke in low voices, considering not just Thomas as an individual, but what his presence meant for the community. Finally, the oldest among them stood and called for everyone's attention. The clearing fell silent. He looked at Thomas and then at Sarah, and then he began to speak about love, about courage, and about the need for bridges between peoples rather than walls. The elder's words carried weight among the gathered families. He spoke of the old days when different tribes and peoples sometimes found common ground through marriage and mutual respect. He acknowledged the pain and betrayal the Apache people had suffered at the hands of white settlers. But he also said that holding on to hatred forever would only poison their own hearts. He looked at Thomas and said that a man who was willing to stand with them against his own people had shown the kind of courage that deserved recognition. However, the elder also issued a warning. He said that if Thomas ever betrayed Sarah or the family's trust, if he ever put his own interests above hers, he would answer not just to her brothers, but to the entire community. Thomas nodded solemnly, accepting this responsibility. The elder then turned to Sarah and asked if this was truly what she wanted. Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and strong, and said yes. She said she loved Thomas and believed in his good heart. With that, the elder gave his blessing. A murmur went through the crowd, some approving, some uncertain, but the elder's word was respected by all. Joseph stood and formally gave Thomas permission to court his sister. The brothers formed a line, and Thomas shook hands with each of them, feeling the shift from suspicion to tentative acceptance. When he reached Daniel, the youngest brother actually smiled slightly and told Thomas not to make him regret this. Finally, Thomas was allowed to approach Sarah. They stood facing each other, both almost afraid to believe this moment was real. Thomas took her hand gently and told her he had missed her every single day. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she told him she had been so afraid he would give up, that the challenges would prove too much. Thomas promised her that no challenge would ever be too great, that he would stand by her no matter what came their way. The gathering continued with music and celebration. Some families remained distant from Thomas, unwilling to fully accept his presence, but others were more welcoming. An older woman who had known Sarah since she was a child came to speak with Thomas, testing his character with sharp questions and keen observation. By the end of their conversation, she seemed satisfied and told Sarah that perhaps she had chosen well after all. As the sun set, Thomas and Sarah were finally able to talk privately, walking to the edge of the gathering where they could see the canyon spreading out before them. Sarah asked him about the past 3 months, and Thomas told her about the work, the challenges, and the moment when he had stood up to Burke and his men. Sarah listened with pride, understanding that Thomas had truly committed himself to her world. Thomas asked Sarah about her confinement, whether her brothers had treated her harshly. Sarah admitted there had been difficult moments, including the slap from Joseph, but she also understood that her brothers acted out of love and fear of losing her. She said the hardest part had been not knowing if Thomas would endure the test, not knowing if she would ever see him again. But she had held on to hope, and that hope had sustained her. They made plans for their future that evening. Thomas would continue to work with Sarah's brothers while building up his own ranch. They would marry in a ceremony that honored both of their backgrounds. They would build a home that welcomed both Apache and white visitors, hoping to be an example of how different peoples could come together. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face whatever challenges came their way. However, not everyone was happy about the arrangement. Clayton Burke heard about the gathering and about the elder's blessing. His hatred intensified, not just toward the Apache families, but now especially toward Thomas, whom he viewed as a traitor. Burke began talking to other ranchers, stirring up resentment and fear. He spread rumors that the Apache families were planning to take more land, that they were a threat to all the white settlers in the area. Several weeks after the gathering, Burke made his move. He organized a group of about 20 men, all armed and angry, and they rode toward the White Horse property with intentions of driving the family out. Someone in town who was sympathetic to the Apache families managed to get word to Marcus, who was there buying supplies. Marcus raced back to warn his family, arriving just an hour before Burke and his men. Joseph immediately began preparing for a siege. He sent the women and children, including Sarah and their grandmother, to a secure location deeper in the canyon. He and his brothers, along with Thomas and a few men from neighboring Apache families who had come to help, positioned themselves to defend the property. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of knowing the land and having good defensive positions. Burke and his men arrived as the sun was setting, their horses kicking up dust as they surrounded the main house. Burke called out for Joseph to come out and face him like a man. Joseph stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, with his brothers flanking him. Thomas stood with them, and Burke's face twisted with disgust when he saw the cowboy among them. Burke shouted that Thomas had one last chance to come to his senses and join the right side. Thomas called back that he was already on the right side, standing with honest people defending their home from an illegal attack. Burke's response was to raise his rifle, and suddenly shots rang out. The defenders returned fire from their positions, and the night exploded with the sound of gunfire and shouting. The attackers had numbers, but the defenders had preparation and motivation. They were fighting for their home, their family, and their future. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. Several of Burke's men were wounded and one was killed. On the defending side, Robert took a bullet in the shoulder but kept fighting. Thomas himself shot a man who was trying to sneak around to the back of the house, wounding him in the leg. The violence was terrible, and Thomas felt sick even as he fought, understanding now the true cost of standing up for what was right. Finally, Burke realized his men were taking too many casualties and called for a retreat. He shouted at Joseph that this wasn't over, that he would bring the law down on them for attacking white men. Joseph shouted back that Burke had attacked them, and that any judge would see the truth. As Burke and his remaining men rode off into the darkness, the defenders slowly emerged from their positions, checking on the wounded and assessing the damage. Robert's wound was serious but not life-threatening. The women were brought back from the canyon, and Sarah immediately went to work helping her grandmother tend to the injured. When she saw Thomas was unhurt, she embraced him tightly, not caring who saw. Thomas held her close, realizing how easily he could have lost her, how easily any of them could have died that night. The reality of their situation had never been clearer. The next morning, Joseph sent Marcus and Daniel to town to report what had happened to the territorial marshal. They brought witnesses who could testify that Burke had organized an armed attack on private property. The marshal, a fair-minded man named Henderson, listened to their account and then rode out to investigate. He spoke to the Whitehorse family, examined the evidence, and then went to question Burke and his men. Burke tried to claim they had only been trying to recover stolen property and had been fired upon first. But his story fell apart when several of his own men, fearful of being charged with murder, told the truth about how Burke had organized the attack. The marshal arrested Burke and 3 others who had been the primary instigators. The rest were fined and warned never to take the law into their own hands again. The incident changed things in the territory. Some white settlers became more hostile toward the Apache families, but others began to question men like Burke who stirred up violence. A few even came forward to do business with Joseph and his brothers, appreciating their restraint and their right to defend their property. Thomas's stand with the Whitehorse family earned him respect from some quarters, though he remained ostracized by others. 3 months after the attack, Thomas and Sarah were married. The ceremony was held at the gathering place in the canyon, with both Apache traditions and a few elements from Thomas's Christian background. The elder who had blessed their courtship performed the ceremony, speaking about the joining of 2 lives, 2 families, and hopefully the beginning of better understanding between 2 peoples. Joseph stood beside Sarah, placing her hand in Thomas's with a solemn expression that slowly softened into something approaching approval. All 5 brothers were present, dressed in their finest clothes. Even Daniel, who had been the most resistant, seemed genuinely happy for his sister. He told Thomas quietly that if he ever hurt Sarah, there would be nowhere far enough to hide, but there was a hint of affection beneath the threat. Thomas assured him that he would spend his life making Sarah happy, and Daniel nodded, satisfied. The celebration lasted 2 days. Families who had been skeptical of Thomas came to see that he was sincere in his commitment to Sarah and to respecting her culture. They saw how Sarah glowed with happiness, how Thomas looked at her with complete devotion. Some of the white settlers who had supported Thomas also attended, creating a rare moment of genuine mingling between the 2 communities. Thomas and Sarah built their home on land between Thomas's original ranch and the Whitehorse property. It was a place where both families felt welcome, where Apache and white visitors could come without judgment. Sarah taught Thomas more about her people's traditions, and Thomas shared his own family's stories and customs. They created something new together, a blending of both worlds that honored each. The first year of their marriage wasn't easy. There were still people in both communities who disapproved of their union. Sarah faced whispers from some Apache families who thought she had betrayed her people. Thomas lost business from white ranchers who refused to deal with an Indian lover. But they had each other, and they had the support of Sarah's brothers, who had become Thomas's brothers too. When Sarah became pregnant with their first child, the entire extended family celebrated. Joseph, who had once struck Sarah for seeing Thomas, now showed unexpected tenderness, already protective of his future niece or nephew. Marcus helped Thomas expand their house to make room for the growing family. The twins carved a beautiful cradle from cedar wood, working on it for weeks to make it perfect. Even Daniel, now 18, seemed excited about becoming an uncle. The baby, a daughter, was born on a spring morning with new flowers blooming across the canyon. They named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Hope for a future where people of different backgrounds could come together in love and respect. When Joseph held his niece for the first time, Thomas saw tears in the big man's eyes. The brother who had seemed so fierce and uncompromising had revealed a gentle heart. Sarah's grandmother, now very old, held Hope and blessed her in the traditional way. She told Sarah and Thomas that they had done something important, not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after them. She said their love had built a bridge, and bridges were always needed even when the crossing was difficult. The old woman passed away peacefully 2 months later, content that she had lived to see her granddaughter happy. Years passed, and Thomas and Sarah had 2 more children, sons this time. The boys grew up speaking both English and Apache, learning traditions from both sides of their heritage. They learned to rope cattle from their father and to track animals from their uncles. They heard stories about white pioneers and Apache warriors, understanding that their blood carried both histories. The territory changed over the years. More settlers came, and tensions continued between communities. But in their corner of the world, Thomas and Sarah maintained their haven of acceptance and respect. Their home became known as a place where disputes could be settled peacefully, where people of different backgrounds could meet on neutral ground. Sarah became a teacher, helping Apache children learn to navigate both their traditional world and the changing reality of white settlement. Thomas never regretted his choice, even during the hardest times. Looking at Sarah, at their children, at the family they had built together, he knew he had found something more valuable than gold or land or acceptance from those who couldn't see past their prejudices. He had found love, purpose, and a way to make the world a little better than he had found it. Sarah, for her part, knew that everything she had endured, the confinement, the slap from Joseph, the fear and uncertainty, had been worth it. Thomas had proven himself in ways that went beyond what anyone could have expected. He hadn't just accepted her world. He had become part of it while still honoring his own heritage. Together, they had shown that love could bridge any divide if people had the courage to build that bridge. Joseph and his brothers eventually found their own paths forward. Joseph never married, dedicating his life to protecting the family and the community. Marcus married a woman from a neighboring Apache family and had children of his own. The twins started a successful horse trading business that served both Apache and white customers fairly. Daniel, the youngest, became a scout and mediator, using his understanding of both communities to help prevent conflicts. As Sarah and Thomas grew old together, sitting on their porch and watching their grandchildren play, they would sometimes talk about those early days. Sarah would touch the place where Joseph had struck her, a moment that had hurt so deeply but had ultimately led to understanding. Thomas would remember the 3 months of hard labor and separation, and how it had forged him into someone worthy of Sarah's love. They had endured so much, sacrificed so much, and risked so much, but sitting there together, surrounded by the family they had created and the community they had helped build, they knew that every moment of suffering had led them to exactly where they needed to be. Their love had not just survived the trials, it had been strengthened by them, becoming a testament to the power of commitment, understanding, and hope for a better future. The sun